Hello and welcome to another episode of Highway to Hill, a pro-Congress podcast about the messiest and most important branch of government. As always, I'm Charlie Hunt, political scientist at Boise State University, and I am joined also, as always, by fellow political scientist, friend, colleague, Sorrel Gaynor from University of Virginia. Hey, Sorrel.
Hey, Charlie.
Today on Highway to Hill, we are at war, question mark. Kind of, but we've got a lot of uncertainty here. What's going on in Iran? What isn't happening in Congress? Is it Congress's job to get in there and weigh in? And how is Congress responding, if at all? And what's next? Lots of uncertain answers to those questions, but we'll do our best. So let's lay some groundwork here a little bit. Trump administration has gone to war with Iran. 3 American soldiers have already died and hundreds of Iranian civilians. And as our president has warned us, there will be more. So, Sorrel, this happened, I think it's safe to say, without a lot of notice to Americans, to Congress. It's all, like, even a week plus later, I am still feeling pretty hazy on what's going on. So what is your sense of things? Like, why, big question, but why are we at war here? Why are we doing this?
We're getting a lot of different answers to that question from the Trump administration. I have a long list. I'll run through some of them. And I think this is also Congress's main question as well. So, it's always, as always, impossible to get into President Trump's head. We're relying on, I saw a great post that was like, we don't know if he's joking or if he's making an actual policy statement a lot of the time. So we're relying on these public statements. Some of the reasoning that's come out is we bombed Iran because of nuclear weapons, even though the White House claimed that they got rid of those last year. At one point, they argued for a regime change. Maybe that's still the case, maybe not. Secretary of State Rubio said there was an imminent threat and that because Israel was going to act, the United States also wanted to get involved to precipitate an attack against American forces. And then he later walked that back.
Can we get into that one for a second? Because that one struck me as really strange. And it's actually an important linchpin kind of for what we're going to talk about around war powers. And when Congress can or should get involved, or when presidents have the technical authority to go, like, they have the authority, as we're going to talk about with the War Powers Resolution, to act in moments of imminent threat. But if there's an emergency. But what Rubio seems to be saying is that there was this assumed threat that existed only because Israel was planning to attack in the first place. But they've also said that we did this in coordination with Israel, and there's still no sense of justification around, like, why Israel now decided to do this. And so it's, I have to say, it all feels a little kind of cooked up after the fact, as kind of a justification. Like, what do you think about what Rubio said here?
I think Senator Chris Van Hollen's quote about this explanation is maybe accurate, which is Netanyahu finally found a president stupid enough to drag into war. This is a critique of this argument, which is to say, like, Israel has always wanted to take this type of military action against the Iranian regime, and usually the United States plays a moderating role in this, right? That is kind of the point of our huge diplomatic network that, of course, was decimated last year with the DOGE cuts. And so I think a big question that Congress has is, what did these negotiations actually look like before they decided that this was the only option? The people that are doing these negotiations are businessmen. They're not necessarily foreign service officials, right? So it's a totally different administration than prior years.
Yeah, or they're, sons-in-law of the president, right? Kushner's case.
Well, there's also some more kind of conspiratorial arguments as well for why the U.S. has engaged in this war. You mentioned one, which is Jared Kushner has a lot of business ties in Saudi Arabia. That's another country that has a lot to gain from Iran, losing access to its trading channels or having its kind of oil refineries threatened, right? There's also reporting, and this gets really dark in my opinion, but there's reporting that Hegseth and military commanders called this war as part of God's divine plan. There were over 200 whistleblower complaints from service members across all branches of the armed forces. So several different complaints were filed about the rhetoric that U.S. military commanders were using to invoke, to justify this war, this like really extreme Christian nationalist rhetoric, which again is a concern and a deviation from prior administrations as far as who's in charge of the Department of Defense.
I was just going to say, it's like Hegseth in particular has sort of, like, Rubio's been out there, Hegseth has been out there, Trump has been making comments about it in between, like being fascinated by the drapes of the new ballroom. And like, it creates, like, the reason all of these different potential explanations are out there is because no one will give us any single one. Like regime, if there's one thing we know from the Donald Trump running for president in 2024 and 2016 for that matter, is we're not going to do these stupid wars, we're not going to have regime change wars. He stocked his cabinet with sort of the kind of America First kind of wing of the party, which ostensibly is not in favor of these regime change wars. But then Hegseth gets up there and says, this is not a regime change war, but the regime sure as hell did change. And like, he had all these sort of like weird little one-liners, none of which actually clarified why we're there in the first place. It's all just kind of this like macho kind of language. It seems to me like they think that just having this kind of hyper masculine energy around like bombs exploding stuff is good, that public opinion will come around. But that is one thing that is different from 2003 in Iraq, which is that public opinion was on their side then, and it does not seem like it is now.
Right. We had a huge terrorist attack that preceded. Whether the tie is really there between 9/11 and a war in Iraq, obviously we know now is pretty questionable. But at the time, there was at least some public sentiment in that regard. And I think you're spot on that a lot of this, this sort of reliance on messaging is one sort of a byproduct of what happens when you put a Fox News host in charge of the largest military in the world. As far as what they're telling us, right, there's no coherent justification, and they need that justification to circumvent Congress, because, of course, Article 1 only grants Congress the authority to go to war.
So, I mean, in a normal situation, right, Congress would be sort of our eyes and ears, right? The people's eyes and ears, doing fact-finding, trying to, like, get a sense for what's going on. And then you would think, and we'll talk about this, granting authorization or not to go along with this, especially given the murkiness around this question of whether there was an imminent threat or not, or whether this was sort of a manufactured threat. So, Congress has gotten some closed-door briefings about this. A lot of the responses have been mixed in terms of whether the administration has offered enough justification. What's your sense for what's going on in Congress? Are they, I'm afraid to even ask this, but are they stepping up to the plate in this particular regard?
It depends. I mean, Democrats are doing, again, what they can. Just as a reminder to everyone, Democrats are in the minority in both chambers, so they cannot just call a congressional hearing. There are a few things that Democrats are doing, and then I'll let you talk about the Republican response or lack thereof. But the first thing that we're going to talk about more in depth is Senator Kaine introduced a war powers resolution, which we'll get into what that is in a little bit. But that vote was earlier this week. It was on Wednesday. And essentially it requires a series of checks and balances for an administration going into war. All but one Democrat, all but John Fetterman, voted for it, and the vote failed. There's also, you mentioned the closed door hearings. Senate Democrats are not impressed with what they're hearing. So they are now calling for these hearings to be public. Again, Senator Van Hollen, who I mentioned earlier, Democrat from Maryland, he said he learned no new information in the closed door hearing. It was, quote, complete incoherence of shifting narratives. Senator Warren from Massachusetts said it's much worse than we thought. You're right to be worried. The Trump administration has no plan in Iran. They are basically, what they're telling us is what we know, which is, like we said, not much, is what they're being told in a closed door hearing, which is supposed to be when you provide intel information that is not publicly, appropriate, right? Things like national security secrets. And they're not even getting that. So that's one thing they're calling for, public hearings. And the third thing that Democrats are calling for, especially more progressive Democrats that are looking down the road, which is eliminate the funding, right? There's already rumblings that the Trump administration is going to request more funding for this very expensive military endeavor. A lot of Democrats like Ruben Gallego from Arizona, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, they're saying, we don't want to pay this bill. They're tying it to these other cost of living questions that Americans are ranking as more important. So I don't know. What are your takeaways from the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what you've just described, Sorrel, these three different buckets are emblematic of these different powers that Congress has, or at least in theory has, over the executive as sort of checks against them that I talk about with my students all the time, right? In the first bucket, you've got these sort of Article 1 war declaration powers, which we'll talk about in the next segment how those play in with the war powers resolutions. You've got this second bucket, which is sort of oversight, right? Having hearings, getting information from the executive, and then acting on it based on this new information. So this sort of information-seeking power. And then you've got this third one, which is the power of the purse that we've talked about before, and basically saying, like, if we can't get you to honor our constitutional powers to declare war, and if we can't get you to give us good information about why this is happening and what is actually happening on the ground and whether we're going to send in troops or how long it's going to last, then we're going to cut the funding, or we're going to limit it or restrict it. It's really interesting because if thinking back to Iraq and Afghanistan, we are old enough to remember it, if not as old as others. As you got into like 2006 and 2007, when public support for the war really went down, you did finally start to get folks saying, like, are we really going to keep funding troops? And of course, you get the argument on the other side of like, oh, you must hate the troops because you don't want to fund them. But you have that political fight around, like, it's not the troops I don't support, it's this ongoing war. And that took like 5 or 6 or 7 years for Congress to get there. And we are 1 week out, and already we have not just Democrats, but Democrats like Gallego or John Ossoff who are in the swingiest of seats, right? These are not safe Democrats.
Right.
Ossoff is up for re-election this year. And I can't help but feel like for those two guys in particular, this is sort of a generational divide, I think.
Yeah.
I think there are some younger members of Congress, especially in the Senate, who sort of came of age in the Iraq War. In Gallego's case, he fought in the Iraq War. So, like, this is, I think, something that really does, in many ways, separate tactically these younger, more progressive Democrats from the old line folks who, like, probably cast votes on the Operation Desert Storm in the early 90s. Like, this is a very different group of people, I think, and a very different Congress as a result.
Yeah, and I also wonder if this is also capturing like the growth in socioeconomic inequality in this short amount of time, right? So, the big beautiful bill and how it funded ICE and gave so much money to ICE is like a really like kind of coherent sticking point that you see on social media, which is like, the meme of like, I just want healthcare, right? And so that's like actually kind of part of their argument here. Gallego said on Twitter, when the bill comes to pay for the replenishment of interceptors and munitions, we aren't cutting more Medicaid food stamps for protecting these countries in a war of choice and not in our interest, right? So they're making this like direct comparison that, we haven't seen in prior similar iterations of this type of policy debate. So the economy continues to matter, which is why I think also why we'll see a ceiling on the public opinion of this for the White House. What I'm scared to ask, what are Republicans saying about this?
I mean, for maybe not surprising, for the most part, they're kind of falling in line. I think I think Mike Johnson, the speaker, had this extended quote basically saying like, so talking in the context of having a War Powers Act vote, basically a vote to limit or place some kind of restriction on what the president can do here. The one that you mentioned failed in the Senate and I don't think they've had the vote yet today when we're recording, but it's going to fail later today. He said the idea that we would take the ability of our commander-in-chief, the president, take his authority away right now to finish the job is a frightening prospect to me. What's a frightening prospect to me is Congress just deciding that they suddenly have absolutely no role in this. Like the meme that was going around this week, that was like, good thing Congress isn't alive to see this. That feels like it's completely embodied in Johnson's quote there. The Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, I think a more tempered support of the president. He said basically, I think the president has the authority he needs to conduct the activities, that he's acting in the best interest of our nation and national security interests. So, leadership seems at least currently to be behind them. But, we have some of the usual or really the two usual suspects, one in the House, one in the Senate, Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, basically saying, this is unconstitutional. We said we weren't going to do it like this again after Iraq. And so, I know the Republicans view them as gadflies, but like they're the ones who are consistent on this, whether we like it or not. So,
and this is, personally frustrating to see that this narrative that Republicans get to maintain this claim over being constitutional conservatives when declaring war is pretty explicit in the Constitution, right? This is Congress's power. Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Like, there's not much interpretation there. And so for Johnson to essentially be afraid of Article 1 and for Senate Majority Leader Thune to say, I think the president has the authority, like, and we'll talk about, right, like, but that's not what the Constitution says. And so it's super frustrating, but it is really interesting to see, like you said, Massie and Paul are consistent in this way about this issue and this like constitutional element. All right, so part of this gray area is sort of in this declaring of war and where, and what the Trump administration is claiming they're even doing here. So a big part of this, we've mentioned it, is this War Powers Resolution. So we'll go to segment 2, our Congress vocab. Charlie, what is the War Powers Resolution? What was its intention? How is it being used today?
We've had these War Powers Act, War Powers Resolution votes in the past week in the House and Senate. This is Congress sort of half-heartedly applying the powers that were facilitated in this original War Powers Resolution of 1973. So this was during the Nixon administration. This is as we're in the process of getting out of Vietnam, another very unpopular foreign adventure. And so, this was a resolution that was basically recognizing this same issue that we seem to have today, which is Congress refuses to use its war declaration powers and is ceding control to the president. And so it was intended to check the president's power when they try to commit troops to combat, and it passed over Richard Nixon's veto. president didn't want it because it had this stated goal to, quote, ensure the collective judgment of both Congress and the president will apply to basically any foreign hostilities and things of this nature. And certainly what's happening with Iran right now is falling under that umbrella. So what it actually did was establish a few procedural requirements, including consultation with Congress, quote, in every possible instance. So maybe some ambiguity there. Basically, that you need a war declaration, you need some other statutory authorization, like an authorization for the use of military force, like we had with Iraq and Afghanistan, that Tim Kaine has been talking about, or some other extraordinary emergency conditions, right, to protect the homeland or military forces abroad. So if the president gets some kind of actionable intelligence that like a threat really is imminent, not like Marco Rubio imminent, but actually imminent, that like they can't, like if a missile's coming in, like you can't be needing to deliberate with Congress. You need to take that action to. So it was also designed to protect the president's ability to like actually command the armed forces in case of an actual emergency. But after that happens, right? If the president does commit those troops or do this enforcement action, it requires a written report to Congress within 48 hours of a commitment. A required end to the activity within 60 days with a possible 30-day extension, unless Congress steps in and says, you got the go-ahead to keep this going as long as you want. This is sort of basically what it tried to do, but this is not how it has played out in practice. One of my favorite sort of pieces of writing about this is by Louis Fisher and David Adler. Came out, even before Iraq, but basically made the argument that the war, even though this resolution was intended to re-empower Congress or at least restore some kind of balance, what it actually did was, quote, compromise the institutional and constitutional integrity of Congress by giving the president a green light to use force anywhere in the world for whatever reason without seeking congressional authority. Basically, that by giving the president full authority for basically 2 to 3 months for any reason, it sort of presupposes presidential authority, and that like, okay, well, if the president gets us into something like this, then it becomes much more difficult to get everybody out, because now it has created this sort of hailstorm of foreign policy and international activity that is then difficult to pull back, and that basically the parameters here were far too wide and gave the president far too much power.
Yeah, and I mean, we're seeing this, we're talking about Iran today, but this is also how actions were taken in Venezuela and Yemen, just, this last weekend in Ecuador, right? And of course, Trump isn't the first president to take advantage of this by any means, but to get to, to really the level of involvement and action in Iran is pretty breathtaking. Okay, so then why is Congress going along with this? Like, why aren't they at least performing something at that 60-day mark?
I mean, my sort of explanation of this is unfortunately kind of about politics and accountability, and I think this fits into a lot of other powers that Congress has abdicated, whether it's the power of the purse or oversight or anything else, which is that taking these actions in the Constitution that fall under your purview can be politically tricky to do. They come with political risk, and politicians are political actors, and so they are, uncomfortable sometimes with crossing this line and asserting these powers, right? So, what Fisher and Adler said was that the War Powers Resolution, the 1973 Act, basically that it, quote, allows Congress the luxury of being politically comfortable with its decisions regarding a military action while providing a convenient forum for criticizing the president, right? So by handing over the power, the sort of initiating power to the president, that they can go out there and criticize the president for what he did without taking accountability for what should have been their decision in the first place. Basically, like, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue here seem to be pretty comfortable with this arrangement, right? That the president likes to have this power, and Congress doesn't generally seem to like the responsibility of having to claw back that authority, right? The ambiguity of the statute means that both sides of the arrangement enjoy political flexibility, which might be nice for them politically, but it leaves us with lots of uncertainty around why we are going to war in any particular situation and what kinds of justifications the president does and doesn't have to give for this kind of stuff.
So, if we're looking ahead, and I know that neither of us are particularly inclined to make predictions, but it seems like, so let's say in 60 days, public opinion has continued to sour, and I think it's unfortunate but likely to say more people will die,
Mm-hmm.
more Americans and foreign citizens will die, so popularity will potentially decrease. It's very hard to gain popularity, right, on an issue like this. So let's say in 60 days, the war is unpopular. What does Congress do? What can Congress do? Are they going to take this vote up again, or does the Trump administration have to hard stop, or how does that like enforcement mechanism work?
Legally speaking, it's tricky because they're taking these votes right now, and Congress is opting in by voting no on these. Congress is opting to give the president leeway. And so I don't see why, if the Trump administration wants to continue the conflict and continue whatever operations they've got going on, why they would not feel like they can't just keep going. Like I said, the longer you stay in, the more difficult it becomes to extract. I mean, the long-term vision of this is like what we saw unfold in Afghanistan a few years ago, right? That it's really difficult, right? This is part of why you don't rush into these things, of course. But I mean, from a public opinion standpoint, like part of why you don't hand over all this power to the president is then you worry about a president who is in political trouble, like President Trump is right now, sort of thinking like, well, the war will continue until morale improves, and like we will just keep doing this, and like you get this path dependence thing where like the more you commit to it, the more you have to commit to it in the future, particularly for something like this, because now you have to keep going until it will have been worth the sacrifice.
Right.
And this is one of the problems, is like what a lot of the administration has been saying, like we're glad the Ayatollah is gone, like he was the worst, but we don't want to be doing this nation building. We don't want to be doing, we don't want to be reforming the whole regime. It's very much like the Venezuela situation where it's like we'll get the guy out but then not do anything. And
Right.
of course, like that also is a recipe for just like it doesn't automatically happen that you get the supreme leader out and then the people just rise up and it's a democracy, right? Like all of these wars have been like an object lesson in people being really short-sighted about how societies and potential democracies work, and we just keep making the same mistakes. So sorry to be a
Yeah, and I
bummer.
mean, no, I mean, I'm going to add to that, which is like this is probably even harder because Iran has 90 million people compared to smaller population countries like Iraq or Ecuador or something like that. So before we move on to our last segment, you're saying, and I want to clarify, make sure I understand correctly, that by taking this vote and therefore saying we're not going to invoke this war powers resolution, they basically have unshackled the president. He doesn't have to fall into this 60-day
Yeah, I mean,
limitation.
I don't know if there is like a challenge, like a court challenge that comes from somewhere else, but I think we have guidance from prior court rulings in this area. So, one that I talk about in class often is this case from 1985, Sanchez Espinoza versus Reagan, which was a response, a suit brought in response to the Iran Contra issue in Nicaragua, which would take a whole other podcast to go into. But basically, the argument, the plaintiff's argument was that the Reagan administration lacked the power to do this, and that there were reparations of some kind that should happen as a result of it. And the district court judge denied it, and then the appellate courts confirmed that denial, right? And this was actually Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she was on the Supreme Court,
Wow, fun fact.
wrote that Congress, quote, has formidable weapons at its disposal beyond the War Powers Resolution, the power of the purse and investigative resources far beyond those available in the courts. But no gauntlet has been thrown down here by a majority of members of Congress. On the contrary, Congress expressly allowed the president to spend federal funds to support paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. If Congress chooses not to confront the president, it is not our task to do so. Court's basically saying, y'all, this is your job. It is really explicitly in the Constitution. You got to clean up your own mess. And so I would not expect the courts to step in here too, especially if you get a conservative court who is happy to cite Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg in their support. So I don't see the court stepping in here either.
And, you know, from our perspective, she has a point.
She does. She sure does. Okay, let's go to the gavel drop. A couple last-minute stories here before we adjourn. Sorrel, I think I'm going to go first this week because it's a direct follow-up on our last episode that we did with Casey on the Texas primary. Of course, the primary happened. We got results, more or less, in both of these big Senate races. And, you know, we talked about in this last pod that probably for the Democrats, their dream scenario is nominating Tallarico under the suspicion that he is maybe more electable, though that's sort of an unknowable question, but they got their wish. Tallarico won by, I think, 6 or 7 points, and Representative Crockett endorsed him shortly after, though not without a little bit of drama in Dallas that I want to ask you about. And then the Republicans are going to a runoff, and there was some defying of expectations here. That, you know, I think we all thought that Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, would get at least a plurality of the votes, but Big John pulled one out of the bag, right?
He did.
He got a couple more percentage points, but not enough to forestall the runoff. So what do you think, Sorrel, as we close the loop on this primary? How did this go compared to your expectations?
Yeah, I mean, John Cornyn did better than I thought. I think the question that remains is some of what we brought up last week, which is Trump going to get involved? He said he's going to endorse someone and the other person should drop out. I don't think anyone will drop out. It's kind of a slap in the face to voters to say, like, F your votes. I'm what matters. I don't think that's really going to work in Texas. But it'll be interesting to see. So the third candidate, Wesley Hunt, got about 15% or so. So obviously, it just matters how those people are going to divide their vote in the May runoff. And I wonder if Cornyn has hit his ceiling, or if, you know, the toxicity of Paxton will make them go to him, or if they'll opt out. So it'll be interesting to see.
And really quick, Sorrel, you had a couple of great Instagram stories about this situation that unfolded in Dallas with the ballots and where people vote. There was this controversy of people getting turned away from the polls. What happened there?
Yeah, so in Texas, as is in the case of many states, most states, parties are responsible for primary elections, right? Because primaries are just the parties deciding who they want to nominate for a position, right? So parties control the primaries, and in most cases, 9 out of 10, parties work together. Democrats and Republican party chairs work together to say we're going to have joint primaries, which just means that anyone who's voting can show up to their voting location and say, I'm a Democrat, I want the Democrat ballot, or I'm a Republican, I want the Republican ballot. It obviously saves a lot of money for the parties. It is efficient. It's easier for the state as a whole. But in 2 counties, notably the counties where the 2 Democratic candidates are from, Dallas, where Representative Crockett is from, and Williamson County, where my high school is, and where James Tallarico is from, the Republican Party chairs said, we don't want to do joint primaries anymore. We want to do non-joint primaries, which means that Republicans have to go to one set of locations and Democrats have to go to another. All legal, allowed, but the catch, and I think the problem here, is that they made this rule change in early February, right? So with early voting around the corner. So not a lot of time for the campaigns or the voters to figure out what was going on. And so in Dallas in particular, A lot of Democratic voters showed up to their former polling places where they were able to vote in all their former elections, and they said, oh no, this is a Republican polling place now, you have to go. And so in some cases they had to drive across town. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. It's important to think about voting access as like the costs that are at hand. So if you have to you've already waited in line, you've been turned away, you've got to get back in your car, drive, go wait in another line. That's a very high cost for a voter. So because of this confusion, the Democratic Party chairs in those two counties filed suit or an injunction with the district courts. And the Dallas District Court said, okay, these polling locations get to stay open 2 or 3 more hours. And that was allowed. And so they said, all right, we're going to count votes until, I believe it was 9 p.m. Ken Paxton, who is not only running in this race, but is the current Texas Attorney General, issued or called for a stay or on this ruling, which just means we're going to take it back. We're not going to allow this to pass. And the Texas Supreme Court, which is controlled by Republicans, agreed with him. But not only did they say, okay, we're going to keep the polling place closed at 7 because they made this ruling after 7 p.m., after votes had been cast, they threw out votes that had already been cast under the guise of this initial ruling, right? So that is voter suppression, right? That's what modern day voter suppression looks like. It's not a poll tax or, whatever. It is kind of tricks like this. And if you have a partisan attorney general, which in all 50 states, attorney generals are responsible for these types of suits and election interference things. So if you have one like Ken Paxton, who has a clear partisan goal here, not a great situation.
No. I mean, I think the thing that bothers me the most, like, yes, we have rules and yes, we have to follow them, but how late that this happened, it is sort of presupposing this same idea behind voter ID, I think, that we talked about, a couple weeks ago, which is like that. I think there's a genuine view held by a lot of folks that like your vote is something you have to earn, and that you have, like, if you're not willing to jump through a couple of hoops to get it, then you don't deserve to have it in the first. Like, I think that a lot of Americans genuinely feel that way, and I just couldn't disagree more. Like, it has to be the fundamental baseline that you get your vote, and that, like, taking a step as drastic as like throwing out votes, that is the absolute last resort instead of the immediate remedy for a situation like this. That was genuinely confusing. But it just reflects, I think, a couple of very different worldviews about like what it means to vote and whether it's a right or a privilege.
I mean, I think that, I can see the argument for saying like, well, they should have known the rules. And if I'm the Texas Democratic Party, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on voter education over the next few months to make sure people show up to the right place. But I think you're right. The throwing out of votes is really, really aggressive and extreme, right? What they could have done, which is what they do when, for instance, you turn in a mail-in ballot that isn't signed or something, is they set those ballots aside and they say, if it's close, we'll come back to these and we'll, revisit them and make sure they're legit, right? But to say blanket, like, these aren't going to count, and all those people were in line with the assumption that they are going to count, right? You could say, okay, it didn't matter because Tallarico won by such a large margin. Like, sure, it didn't matter for the outcome of this election, but it has major implications for the precedent in the upcoming May runoff, as well as the general election, not only in Texas, but in any other state where attorney generals are looking at this with a twinkle in their eye, if you will.
Yeah. Also, even if it doesn't matter for the outcome of the election, it matters for the person who voted. Like,
yes,
it matters for them on an individual level. Like you talked about a couple weeks ago, Sorrel, like voting, one thing political science says again and again, it's a habit forming activity, that the more you do it and the more you feel empowered by the act of voting, the more likely you are going to in the future. And this just shows, like, to me, reckless disregard for the priority that I feel like we should all have, which is that more people should vote. People should vote. Like,
yes.
And that if you are taking these actions, it's sort of, to me, it kind of shows like you don't care whether people vote in the future or not. But maybe that doesn't matter so much if it's people you don't agree with. So on that happy note, let's go to your gavel drop, which I think is a little more positive.
It is more positive. So we were talking about oversight and what Congress can do to actually do real oversight, and we saw some of that this week. So, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem was before the Senate Oversight Committee, and you may have seen these clips. I did share them on my Instagram as well. Tom Tillis went ham on Kristi Noem, right? He went after her, killing her dog, like all sorts of stuff. But he did something really important, right? So he's pointing out this really sketchy use of funds and who they're deciding to give these government contracts to. And he points out that the inspector general, so again, every agency has this internal sort of oversight board, like lawyer, that looks into concerning issues, right? So that's the inspector general. And Kristi Noem and the DHS has, I think it's like 11 outstanding requests from the inspector general to answer questions, a lot of them about like how they're spending their money and the government contractors that they're working with. So Tillis goes on this tirade. It was awesome in my, loving Congress perspective that says, and he basically said, if you don't answer these within a week, I'm going to hold up legislative business. I'm not going to confirm or vote on any nominations until you respond, right? So, one, he performs this big public action, which is a form of oversight as well, but then he takes like very real legislative threats. Like, I'm going to muck up all of congressional action, all floor activity until you perform this thing, right? So there was just like tons of great oversight about how DHS is spending their money, which, they're still shut down technically. But I don't know why do you think this hasn't been used by more people, including the minority party?
Well, I mean, one key factor for Tillis, of course, is that he's not running for re-election. It's amazing how just saying that can free you up in all sorts of ways. By no means is Tillis like the most Trump critical Republican over the course of the last 10 years, but there's been a big difference between pre-announcement and post-announcement, Tom, here. I get it. Like that's how it goes if you don't have to worry about a primary, like the one that's going down with Cornyn and Paxton. Like that
Right.
explains a lot. But it is nice seeing someone like Tillis who like embraces the role as a senator, recognizes that as a senator, as a member of the Senate, you have a lot more individual power to muck things up than any one individual member of the House. So that's sort of using that specifically senatorial prerogative that you have to hold things up to the maximum amount. And I think, I think between the public stuff that we've seen from Noem, the wild reporting from ProPublica and the Wall Street Journal and some of these other outlets about like the absolute shit show that appears to be DHS right now, and that it's happening in the midst of this shutdown, by the way, that still hasn't technically ended with Department of Homeland Security. And so, I think this is signaling that Kristi Noem is in some trouble. I think that there's been some reporting by Punchbowl that Trump is talking about potentially firing her and replacing her maybe with Markwayne Mullin, who has been on TV a lot, talking through this stuff. And it's one of those things like, has Mullen been on TV a lot because he's auditioning, because like he's in talks to replace her, or is he in talks to replace her because Trump has been watching TV and seeing him with his big cowboy hat do his thing? So I don't know.
I think Tillis's strategy of mucking up the Senate floor is like targeting his peers and saying like, we need to use our oversight power. But his big show is holding up papers and yelling. That's directed at the president. And so reporting is coming out that now Trump is asking around the Hill if he should fire Noem. So oversight works, I think, to tie it all back to where we began. And it definitely works the best when it's coming from the majority party, who happens to be the same party as the president.
It sure does work. We love when Congress does its job, and it's always a mixed bag week to week here. That'll do it for Highway to Hill this week. Sorrel, thanks as always.
Thank you.
See you guys next time.
Bye.